Welcome everybody to this tutorial for the MLA 8th edition Works Cited page. A couple of things to note before we get started. First, we are dealing with the Modern Language Association's 8th edition of the MLA handbook. We're also using Word 2016 and a Windows computer. If you're using a previous version of the MLA, if you're using a different version of Word, or if you're on a Macintosh computer, some of this tutorial may not apply to you. Secondly, this is not a replacement for the handbook itself. The handbook is fairly inexpensive. It only costs about $10 from Amazon, and it's going to go into a lot more detail on the ins and outs and the quirks of the citation format. Third, we are focused on the Works Cited page specifically. We're not going to go into how to do in-text citations, how to format the page properly. We're going to assume that you've done all of that correctly the first time around. The good news is that that hasn't changed between MLA 7th edition and 8th edition, so you can also check out the tutorials that deal with 7th edition on those issues. A couple of assumptions before we get started. First, that your page has 1-inch margins. Second, that you're working with 12-point Times New Roman font throughout the document. Third, that the document is double-spaced throughout with no additional spacing elsewhere. Fourth, that you have a header in the upper right-hand corner indicating your last name and page number. And fifth, that the heading and title for your paper are at the start of your document along with your document text. We're going to pick up right after your last paragraph in your essay or paper. First, let's go over some of the major changes that they've made between MLA 7th edition and MLA 8th edition, in case you're already familiar with the MLA 7th edition citation formats. First, if you cite a website, it is now recommended that you include the URL. They've gone back and forth in this between MLA 6th edition and 7th edition. They're switching back. You do need to put it in there. Secondly, you only have to include the access date for an online source if you don't have the publication date. So for things like newspaper articles or journal articles that have the date, you can still provide the access date, but it's not required. Third, with publisher information, it is no longer necessary to cite the city of the publisher unless the work is dated before 1900, simply because in the modern media environment, it's not really necessary. Fourth, you don't need to list the medium of the work, so you don't need to put web, print, DVD, whatever. It's just assumed. Fifth, for sources with more than 2 authors, only the first author is listed, and then you put the et al. Afterward. It used to be only done for authors, for sources that had 4 or more authors. Now they're down to 3 or more authors, so keep that in mind. Sixth, in general, MLA has become more flexible and customizable depending on your particular needs. So if certain information in a citation isn't important to the discussion, and it's not necessary in order for somebody to track down your original source, you don't need to include it in the citation. So in other words, in MLA 8th edition, there's no really right way to cite something so long as you've got practical information that can help somebody locate your source. And then lastly, please note that your instructor may not have switched over to all of MLA 8th edition, and so their expectations might be different than what the actual guide specifies. When in conflict, you should always follow your instructor's recommendations because they ultimately are the one giving you the grade, not the Modern Language Association. So we're going to start by walking you through the different components of the citations and then going into some examples. First, we'll start with the author. The author has a couple of different guidelines depending on how many authors you have, what type of author it is, and so on. The most basic format, if you've only got one author, is last name, comma, first name, period. And if they have a middle initial, you can put that after the last name, but you don't need to put an additional period after that. So, for instance, if their name was Jane Smith, you would just put Smith, comma, space, Jane, period. If it was Jane A. Smith, you would put Smith, comma, space, Jane, space, A, period. And that's all you need. Now, if you've got 2 authors, first of all, don't change the order. If you've got multiple authors, never change the order of it. There's a lot of politics involved into who gets top billing on a work. But you put the first author in that same reverse name format, but the subsequent author, the second author, you just include with their name laid out as is. So, for instance, if you had somebody, let's say Jane Smith and John Doe wrote a book together, you would still put Smith, comma, space, Jane, but instead of a period after Jane, you would put a comma, space, the word and, not an ampersand, but the actual word and then John Doe, just straight right off the bat, and then put a period afterward. Now, if you've got 3 authors, as we mentioned before, you're only going to cite the first author. So put that first author in that same last name, first name format, followed by a comma and a space. And then you put the Latin phrase et al, et space al, period. This is an abbreviation for the Latin phrase et ali, meaning and others. So it basically tells your readers that this work had more than just Jane Smith on this. It had a whole bunch of different authors on this, and we didn't have time or space to list them all out. Now, if you've got a source that is authored by an organization or committee or a group of people, and that group or committee has an official name, you're going to use that name as the author's name. You don't want to abbreviate anything. Just put the name of it. So, for instance, if it's the U.S. Committee on Railways, you would put U period S period space committees period or committees space committee space on space railways space period. And you would just put it that way, and that's how you're going to sort it alphabetically. So don't try to swap it around. Don't sort it by something else other than that first letter in their name. Now, if you don't have an author at all, which is especially going to be the case in online works, like if you just find a web page that you want to cite, that sort of thing, then begin the entry with the title of the work. You don't want to list the author as anonymous or anon or unknown or anything like that, even if your source has that listed as the author. So if the source truly is anonymous, don't put any sort of name, just begin with the title. It helps cut down on the confusion. Next, we're going to discuss the title of the work. And there's a couple of things that are weird about the title that I want to go over. The first is the capitalization. There are specific rules on how to capitalize titles in MLA, and you want to format them this way regardless of what the source wants you to do. So even if the source title is all in caps or all in lowercase, you need to make sure that it adheres to these MLA guidelines for capitalization. We're going to put everything into title case, where most of the words are capitalized. You want to capitalize the first word, all nouns, all pronouns, all verbs, all adjectives and adverbs. And you also want to capitalize subordinating conjunctions, which are going to be conjunctions that help describe additional information. You don't want to capitalize articles like a, an, or the. You don't want to capitalize prepositions like in, of, against, between, on, or to. And you also don't want to capitalize coordinating conjunctions like and, but, for, or nor. The difference between subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions can be really confusing because, especially for subordinating conjunctions, they can often take the place of different parts of speech depending on where they fall in the sentence. When in doubt, however, it's probably best to leave the things that you absolutely know are supposed to be in lowercase, and then just capitalize everything else. Now, there's also a difference of formatting depending on what type of work it is. You want to put larger works in italics. These might be whole books, whole websites, entire movies, that sort of thing. They're all going to be larger works. You want to put their titles into italics. But if it's a smaller work, some work that's part of a series or is found inside of a book, you want to put those in quotation marks. That includes most things like newspaper articles, episodes in TV series, entries in dictionaries, titles of journal articles. These are all going to be in those quotation marks. Now, you want to end your title in a period, but remember, if your title is encompassed in those quotation marks, the period goes inside of the quotation mark, not outside of it. And never put two periods next to one another, even if the title has a period already in it. So if you've got a larger work, you can safely move on. But if you've got a smaller work, as most of you probably will have, especially for citing things like articles, you need to have the title of the container after the title of the work. So for smaller works, this is going to be the larger body of work that contains it. If you found an entry in a dictionary, if you've got a page on a website, if you've got an article in a newspaper, the larger piece is going to be whatever your title container is. And it's formatted the same way as the italicized title. So it's going to be in that same title case, but it's going to be in italics. And you're going to end it in a comma rather than in a period, because we have to include a little bit of information about whatever that larger container is. The first bit of information that we need to have for our container, or even for our larger works, are going to be any other contributors that we might have for a source. So this might include editors or translators that are playing an integral role in creating whatever this work is. Translations in particular really need to have the translator name located in there, because if you're referencing the translation in particular, the words might be different than the original source or a different translation. You need to include the person by their proper title. So, for example, after that comma of the container, you need to put like edited by Jane Doe or something similar. Now, if you're focusing on a particular character in a film or television show, and that's who you're actually referencing, and the performer is not playing the vital role in that, you can mention the performer there. So, for example, performance by John Doe. And you want to follow the contributor's name with a comma. The next bit of information is going to be the version of whatever container or larger work, if you're working on a book, may have. So if your source has multiple editions, and this is especially true for things like textbooks, you need to list the edition after the section so that people know which version you're referring to. For numbered editions, indicate it with the digit and the appropriate abbreviation. So for example, the third edition of a book will be indicated by the number 3, RD, space, ED, period, and we'll abbreviate edition down to ED. Now for a named edition, we're still going to abbreviate edition down, but we leave the rest intact. So for example, if it's an updated edition of a book, we would change that to updated space ED period. This is also true if you've got a movie or a film that you're referencing and you're specifically looking at the director's cut or the uncut version. You need to include that information here. That way they know it's not the theatrical run. You follow that information with a comma even if your abbreviation ends in a period. So for that third edition, you would end it with a comma even though it's a comma and a period right in succession. The next bit of information is the number. And some sources are going to have numbers that are just always going to be a part of them, and you need to make sure you include them here. In the 7th edition, it was always you just put it as numbers, and it was without any context, and you didn't really know what they're for. Here, you need to be more explicit. So for journal articles in particular, they're going to have volume numbers and issue numbers, and both are included in this section and abbreviated appropriately. So, for example, if you have the second issue of the 24th volume of a journal, you're going to abbreviate it as VOL period space 24 comma space NO period space 2. And that indicates that you have volume number 24, issue number 2. And sometimes that's going to look weird on journal articles. You may have it where the volume number is just a number and then the issue number's in parentheses. They may actually spell out volume and issue. Whatever, but you want to abbreviate it appropriately and make sure you include that information in there. Now, that'll also include serial publications. Magazines typically have volume and issue numbers. Comic books will have issue numbers, so if you're referencing a comic book, you want to include that. And television shows will usually have seasons and episode numbers. You want to include both of those in this section as well. You follow the number section with a comma. Now, the publisher information is going to be mandatory, and that comes next. And it's mandatory for books, films, and certain websites. Not all websites are going to need the publisher information, but it's not needed for periodicals at all, like newspapers or journals. It's assumed that the name of the container is sufficient in these cases. So the Washington Post, we really don't need to know who owns the Washington Post. A lot of times it's just going to be redundant information anyway. The same is true for websites. If a website's publisher is the same name as the website or substantially similar, you don't need to include it there. But if they are part of a larger media group, you typically want to put that larger media group like Condé Nast or Gawker Media or something like that in this section under the publisher. Remember, you don't need to include the city information for it. You just need to have the publisher's name in there. And then after the publisher, put a comma. After the publisher, you want to include one of the most important parts, which is the date of publication. You want to put the date of your publication after the publisher information, but the format depends on what type of source that you have. For books, you want to choose the most recent date printed on the copyright page. Now, this may or may not be the same year as the copyright date, especially if the book has been reprinted or republished multiple times. Now, for newspaper articles, dated website posts, television broadcasts, and those sorts of things, you need to put the full date in there, and that's going to be in day, month, year format. So, for example, if you've got a newspaper article from December 2nd, 2016, you need to list it as 2 space DEC period space 2016. We abbreviate all of the months except for May, June, and July because they're fairly short. But the rest of them, abbreviate them down typically to 3 letters plus the period. Now, for journal articles, the dates here get a little bit tricky. You need to check the date on the article itself. Often they're only going to be listed by the year, but occasionally it will also list the season. For example, some will say things like spring 2011. And in these cases, you want to make sure you're capitalizing the season that it is in there. If it is only listing months, like say July, August issue, you want to abbreviate them according to the rules we've talked about before. Now, if a source doesn't have a publication date at all, like you can't find one, you don't know exactly when it's published, it used to be you had to include something in there about, oh, I couldn't find the date. Now you don't need to put the information into your reference, but you will need to have an access date that we will talk about a little bit later on. At the very end of the date, you typically want to put a comma unless you're done with a citation. Now, the final key piece of information is the location of the work. This is especially important for articles and web pages, which you're typically not going to have a physical printed copy of. These things you need to actually say where you got it from. So for the sections of a printed document, such as a selection from a book, you'll need to include the page number or numbers that you found it on. If it's a source that was on a single page number, you would designate it with a P. So for example, a poem on page 42 will be listed as P period space 42 period. Now, if you have a run of pages, which is more common, especially for journal articles, you're going to designate that with PP period. So, for example, a journal article that runs between pages 342 and 355 will be PP period space 342 hyphen 355 period. Now, if you're citing a peer-reviewed journal article that is stored in a major electronic database, you will also need to include the name of the database after the page number. And typically their name will be capitalized in title case and italicized, followed by a comma. So for instance, for JSTOR, you're going to put that name in italics after the page numbers, but before the next section, which is the URL. So for web pages or any resource that you find online, you want to include the URL or Uniform Resource Locator, which is in the box near the top of your web browser. You need to omit the http:// or the https:// from the URL, so leave that out when you copy and paste. So for example, an article in the New York Times is going to begin with www.newyorktimes.com / and then you put the rest of the URL, whatever that is. And we'll walk through some of the examples of what that looks like. You want to include a period after the location, even if it's a URL. And if there's any punctuation marks, that sort of thing, in the URL, you want to include an additional period outside of it. But as mentioned before, if you're citing a web page that doesn't have a date of publication, you must include an access date that you accessed that website on. So, for example, if you're citing an online dictionary and you found that definition, you looked that definition up on November 8th, 2016, you would write accessed space 8 NOV period space 2016 period. And that's really all you need to include there. Remember, for that access date, if you have a publication date, you don't necessarily need it, but remember that some of your professors may not be aware of that and are expecting the access. Okay, so if you stuck with us so far, we're now going to proceed into just a few examples and how to set up your Works Cited page. So Again, we're assuming that you're using Word 2016 on Microsoft Windows, and I'm going to be using the keyboard commands more than the mouse, and I just find it easier. It's oftentimes difficult to hunt down exactly where the little icons are on the page, and using the hotkeys is often quicker. So to begin, we're going to start at the very end of our document. You can see we're right here at the very last sentence in the last paragraph. We'll hit enter once, and that gets us to a blank line. Now we want to start our Works Cited page on a brand new page. And you don't want to just hit enter a bunch of times to try to get down to the next page. Instead, you want to insert a page break. The way we do that is by hitting Alt, and you can see that turns on the keyboard commands. All of them pop up here in the little menu bar. We can turn it off again. So we'll hit Alt, and we want to insert the page break, so we hit N and B for break, and you can see it jumps right down to there. If you did want to use your mouse, you would go to the Insert tab and hit the little page break icon here. So now that we're on the new page, we want to put the title of the Works Cited page, which is just Works Cited. And we're going to use our keyboard commands and hit Control-E, which you can see moves the cursor to the center. Also on the Home tab, you could just hit that little icon there, and that'll center your paper as well. We want to type Works Cited with a capital W, O-R-K-S, space, cited, capital C-I-T-E-D. And that's all we need for that. Now we need to enter down to the next line, and then we need to change it back to left align, as it is for the rest of the document. You can again do that via the mouse if you wanted to. You click on that little icon, or if we hit Control-L, you can see it jumps right back to the beginning. Now the last little bit we need to do before we start typing in our Works Cited is that we need to add what's called a hanging indent. And there's two ways to do that. You could either go to the paragraph menu through this little tiny icon right up here, or if we're using keyboard commands, you hit Alt, H for the Home tab, and PG for paragraph. And that'll open up our paragraph menu. We want to tab down to the special section under indentation and type H for hanging. It defaults to a 1/2 inch, which is exactly what we want. And if we hit enter, it's all set up. Now it doesn't look like anything's happened, but if you were to type a really long line, so a really long entry, you can see that the second line now starts tabbed in 1/2 inch, and that's exactly what we want. The only thing we want along that 1 inch margin are new lines for citations, and that allows us to count and find citations much easier. Now I'm not going to go too much into the ordering of citations, but they do need to be capitalized based on whatever the first word or words in the entry is. So if it's the last name of the author, if it's the title because you don't have a name, if it's the organization's name, it all needs to be capitalized based on that. And if you've got multiple works by the exact same author or authors, so for instance, Spear, William, if you have 2 entries that are by William Shakespeare, you don't actually put in both entries, so you don't start typing Shakespeare again. Instead, you insert 3 hyphens and a period to substitute for the author's name. Now that's not true if you have one author that's the same, but a second author, say Francis Bacon, you wouldn't put the 3 hyphens in if you only had a work that was by William Shakespeare following that. So you want to also alphabetize based letter by letter. So something always precedes nothing. And what that means is that Descartes, D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S, is going to come before De Soto, which is D-E space S-O-T-O. So you can see here, because Descartes with the S is all one word, that's going to go before De Soto, because De Soto has that space in the middle, and it's just automatically going to bump it there. Okay, let's get into some real-world examples. The first example that I'm going to give you is a book. It's called The Color Purple by Alice Walker. And I've taken a look at the copyright page already. So first we want to start with the author's name, which is Alice Walker. We want to put it in that reverse format. So it's going to be Walker, W-A-L-K-E-R, comma, space, Alice, A-L-I-C-E, period. We want a space, We want to put the title of the book in italics because it is a full book. So to turn on italics, we can hit Control I, which you can see the cursor change to the slanted version, or you can press that little icon up there and then type the color purple. And it's going to be, every word here is capitalized because the is the first word, and color and purple are both important words. And we'll finish that up by turning off italics, Control I again, and putting a period, followed by a space. Now the publisher of my version is Pocket Books, so we'll put that in caps, Pocket Books, followed by a comma and a space. And then we'll put the year of publication, which in this case is 1982 for my version. And that's all the information that we need according to MLA 8th edition for this particular book. There weren't a whole lot of editions that I had to go into. There weren't additional authors, so it's a really simple entry. We'll hit enter to go to the next line, and we'll start on the next one. And this is going to be a poem out of an anthology of poems, which is a textbook that I happen to have. And this poem is called The Pardon by Richard Wilbur. It's found in Contemporary American Poetry, which is edited by R.S. Gwynn and April Linder, published by Penguin Academics in 2005. So, first things first, I'm going to put the author's name. The author's name is Richard Wilbur, so I'm going to put Wilbur first, W-I-L-B-U-R, comma, space, Richard, capital R-I-C-H-A-R-D, period, space. Now, because it's a smaller work, I'm going to put it in quotation marks. So I have my open quotation marks. The Pardon. Both words are going to be capitalized. The because it's the first word. Pardon because it's an important word. And I'm going to put the period inside of the quotation marks before I close it, followed by a space. I'm going to put the container, which is Contemporary American Poetry, in italics. So I'll hit Control I to switch to italics and type Contemporary American Poetry. I'll turn off italics and put a comma. Now, because it's an edited book, remember, we want to include that as the contributor. So I'm going to put edited by R.S. Gwynn. I don't have a first name, so I'm just going to put R period S period Gwynn, G-W-Y-N-N, and April Linder. Notice I don't reverse the citation or the names, the last name, first name, that sort of stuff for the editors. I'm going to put a period and a space. I will then put the publisher. The publisher in this case is Penguin Academics. Comma, space, the year of publication, which is 2005, another comma and a space. And this poem stretched 2 pages, so I will put PP period space, and the page number is 18-19, followed by a period, indicating that it stretched the 2 pages in that book. And then I'll hit enter. Once again, you'll notice that hanging indent kicked in, so this entry was long enough that it stretched 2 lines, but that second line began indented in. Now my next entry is a newspaper article, and this is going to be from Angela Fritz. So because it's her last name is Fritz, we're going to go before Walker, and we'll enter Walker down. And then we'll start typing this name, so Fritz, F-R-I-T-Z, comma, Angela, period, space. And because it's a newspaper article, we're going to put the title in quotation marks, and the title is, and it's a long one, This is How the Devastating Gatlinburg Wildfire Erupted Overnight. And I'll put a period. Now, it's important to note that the Washington Post and many other news websites capitalize things differently than the MLA guide does. For the Washington Post, for instance, it's almost all in lowercase except for whatever proper nouns you have. It's called sentence case. We change the capitalization even though the title is capitalized differently. In this case, the only word that isn't capitalized is the article the, because it's an article that occurs in the middle of the sentence, but every other word in that is important. After the closed quotation mark, I'm going to hit space, and I'll put the name of the container in italics, which is the Washington Post, followed by turning off the italics and putting a comma. We then want the date of the article, which in this case was the 29th of November, so I'll put 29 NOV period space 2016 period. And then we'll type in the URL. The URL is really long. I'm not going to bore you by typing it in. Typically, you would want to copy and paste the full thing. For now, I'm just going to put www.washingtonpost.com/article.html, which is not the actual URL. You would want to use the real one, followed by a period and a space. You'll notice that in Microsoft Word, it changes our URL to a link for us. It's perfectly fine to leave that as is. You don't need to keep it as text. The MLA understands that a lot of these documents are going to be in electronic format anyway, so it's often easier just to leave it there. After the period, you want to make sure we have the access date. I'm putting it here. Because we have a publication date, we don't strictly need it, but many instructors are still going to require it. And especially for online newspaper articles, they sometimes change both in title and in content. So it's often a good idea to put the access date just so your audience knows that when you take a look at this document, it contained the information that you said it did. So in this case, it was accessed on December 12th. So I will put accessed, capital A, CCESSED, space, and then the date 12, DEC period, 2016, followed by a period. And you'll notice the hanging indent once again kicked in there. The next entry is going to be a peer-reviewed journal article, and this is about writing centers, so it's kind of appropriate. And the author is Irene L. Clark. Now, because Clark precedes Fritz, we're going to go back up to Fritz. We're going to enter down to give us a blank space and go up. And we're going to start last name first, so Clark, comma, Irene, I-R-E-N-E, space. And because she has a middle initial, we're going to put it in L, period. Now, we don't put another period. We just have that one there. So we're going to hit a space. And then we'll put the title of the work in quotation marks. And this is the title of the article itself. Collaboration and Ethics in Writing Center Pedagogy, followed by a period, the end quotation marks. Now, in this case, we have two words that aren't capitalized. We have the "and," which is the coordinating conjunction. We also have "in," which is going to be our little preposition there. So we don't want either of those capitalized, but all of the rest of the words are going to be important. A lot of times in peer-reviewed journal articles, they're going to use proper title case, so you can typically pull right from them on it. But be careful, because some older journal articles and some storages, some databases are going to put them all in caps, which is not what you want. Make sure you're hitting that title case as it should be. We'll put a space after the closed quotation mark, and we're going to put the journal name. So in italics, Control I to switch to italics. And the journal's name is the Writing Center Journal. All capitalized. Turn off italics, put a comma. And because this is a peer-reviewed journal article, remember, we're going to have the number information for volume and issues. So we're going to put VOL, all in lowercase, period, space, 9, comma, space, NO period, space, 1, which indicates it's the first issue of the 9th volume. We'll put a comma. The date on this is fall/winter 1988. And it's important to remember that fall and winter are capitalized. Even though in normal text we wouldn't capitalize the seasons, we're capitalizing it here because it's actually it's referring to the date. After the 1988, we'll put a comma and a space, and then the page numbers that it's located on. So this article stretched a number of pages. We'll put PP, period, space, 3-12, followed by a period. Now, I pulled this journal article from one of those big electronic databases. In this case, it was JSTOR. So I will italicize and in all caps put JSTOR, which is the name of the database, and turn off caps and put a comma. And then I'll put the URL. Sometimes you may have a DOI, but for JSTOR, they're going to provide you with URLs that are stable, and so that way, even if somebody comes to it years later, they're going to be able to find the link to this article. Because it's a URL, remember you don't start with the HTTP. You just go www.jstor.org/stable/ and in this case, it has a number associated with it, which is 434-60766. And I'll put a period and a space if you want to. We're done with the entry. And you can see it also turns that into a URL. The last example is when you have something that you're citing that doesn't have an author or a date. These are typically going to be web pages. In this case, I'm citing a dictionary. And the word I'm citing is rhetoric. Now, because rhetoric starts with an R, and we don't have an author, we're going to alphabetize based on the title. So for rhetoric, it's going to go here right after Fritz, but before Walker. We'll type enter to get to a new line. And we want to put the title in quotation marks just as we did before. So rhetoric, R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. And we'll put the period inside of the quotation marks. Now, the name of the website that I got this definition from is merriam-webster.com. So we will put it in italics for the container. The name of the website is merriam-webster.com. And we'll put a period after that. Now, important to remember, because the website is substantially similar to the name of the publisher, Merriam-Webster, we're not going to put Merriam-Webster in as the publisher. We're just going to leave it as is there. If it had changed names, if it wasn't substantially similar, we would also want to put in the publisher name, but we're good here. Then we want to follow that with the location, which is going to be the URL. Followed by a period and a space. Now, because we don't have a date of publication, remember, it is absolutely necessary that we put the access date. Just in case that definition changes, people know how old that link really is and that we did our due diligence. So we're going to put capital A accessed, A-C-C-E-S-S-E-D, and we accessed this on December 12th, so we'll put 12, capital D-E-C, period, 2016, period. And that is all we need. So those are some of the major types. We didn't really cover multiple authors, what you would do there, or if you had similar authors of the same name. But by and large, those are going to be the basic ones that hopefully you're using, especially those peer-reviewed journal articles, which we always like to see, as well as the sections out of books and the full books themselves with MLA. If you do have any questions or need additional information, feel free to leave comments below, check with your instructor, or even go to your university writing center. And thank you very much for watching.